Hair textures don't have to be a nightmare. Fibershop make it effortless and I'm going to prove it to you. Alright, so I want to introduce you to Fibershop, but let's start just with the basics first so you understand how the major windows and how to navigate here. So the most important here about Fibershop is about the fiber blocks. So as you can see here on the left, you're going to find the fiber block window. Here under the window, you can establish the different blocks. So you can create a whole bunch of different blocks. As you can tell, every time I'm pressing new block, a new block is going to show up. And you can perform a bunch of like very basic actions, like for example, scale it up and down. You can even rotate it. But at this stage, this is something that possibly if you're working in hair card texture generation, you want to make sure that all of them are pointing vertical, since you're going to be later on also exporting the isotropic texture file. So you have different parameters that you can play, like the viewport, the document setting as well. In this case, you can establish already the radio. By establishing the radio, you can already establish how you want your texture orientation to happen. But you can perform a whole bunch of different setups, like for example, creating the document orientation horizontal, so you will be creating the texture enlarged in a horizontal axis. By default, in most of the cases, you probably want to work in auto and one by one, okay? And other than that, I didn't touch any of these other settings. The only setting that actually you want to touch is actually under preference. You want to perform an U scale. In my case, I'm working in a 4K resolution. So depending on which scale I'm using, let's say, for example, I'm using a factor of 1, the UI is going to look smaller. If I not run by default, it comes with 0 or something like that. And I noticed that if I want actually to work with a proper UI, I do need to establish a factor of 2, and now it's easier to work, okay? This is actually pretty important. Then we have our viewport navigation. Here, you have different shading models. You can see how it will look like root to tip. You can see the alpha, how it looks like. You can see the height. You can see pretty much every single channel that normally is generated when creating hair textures. One of the great things about Fibershop is the fact that allow you to see the cards also in the 3D viewport. Sometimes this can be useful. I personally cannot prefer working always in the 2D viewport, but just by visualizing everything on the 3D viewport, you can see how things look. This can be actually pretty interesting. So by that, we're going to be jumping under the Design tab. This is probably the tab that you're going to be playing the most when trying to get the look of your cards. Right now, let's use this first block just to set up a more parametric vibe. So let me explain you how it works. The way it works is actually pretty cool because it works pretty much as any hair generation. I'm a big fan of XGen in Maya, and you in Maya have the classic modifiers like clamping, noise, bend, etc. And here by default, you already have all the same modifiers. So normally you will always start with a clamp modifier to create a differentiation from root to tip. So we're going to add a clamp modifier. As you can tell, the clamp modifier adds on top of the main modifier. In this case, is the main scatter. And you can always turn on and off each modifier. And that's the great thing about it. We are jumping already into a non-destructive workflow, which is great in this type of cases. So let's say, for example, all right, I want my card to have definitely less clamp variations. So one of the things that you can do here under clamp scatter, you can decrease the width density. Just by doing that, automatically it's going to generate less main clamps. Let's, for example, in this case, we can add some more depth intensity. Some randomness can be very interesting because automatically it's going to generate some differentiations as well, which is pretty cool. And then some depth randomness. It also improves the clamp quality. Let's add on top of this a noise modifier. So it cannot work exactly as you imagine. You're going to already establish some noise in the clamp itself. You can establish the strength, and something that I really like is the fact that you can establish the shift of how this noise perform on the clamp, or at least in the fiber block, right? So we can establish a whole bunch of randomness. We can even establish the length of it. The bigger is the length, the more frequent is the noise happening. So you can do a whole bunch of different items. And as you can tell, everything is actually updating automatically on the viewport. And again, I can jump to a different fiber block, adjust whatever the heck I want, come back to the other block, and all my parameters are going to be stored. And that's something that I love about this tool, is the fact that it makes everything easier. All right, let's come back to the main scatter. One of the parameters that I try to touch on the main scatter is actually the root differentiation. So one thing that you want to do here, you want to jump under root slope, and you want to improve this. This is going to make sure that the roots don't generate on the same root level, or at least in the same position. When you are creating haircuts, or at least hair textures, the most important about these textures is the fact that they don't look even. It needs to look natural. So Fibershop already gives you all the different parameters that you need to create this type of randomness. Then you have a whole bunch of different parameters that you can play with. You have the width of the major fiber block, you have the depth. By default, you won't see much, but if you jump into the 3D viewport, you can see how depth works. What it's going to do is going to create precisely more depth in that fiber block. You can also have reduction. Reduction is you can establish your main scatter, and just by playing with reduction, you can reduce the amount of fibers will be reproduced in that fiber block. A quick heads up. If you're an Art Heroes student or a member of RenderDat, you're getting an exclusive 80% discount on Fibershop. That's almost for free, and trust me, it's absolutely worth it. Check the link in the description for all the details. If there is one other modifier that you want to implement in every single fiber block, is the length randomness. This, the way it works, is going to make sure that every single hair that is going to be generated doesn't have the same length. By default, I like to make sure that I play with a small value, just to be sure that all my tips end in different positions. When it comes to segments, you need to think about Fibershop as a whole bunch of different splines generated, because I believe that's the way it works. Every spline is going to be divided by different segments. The less segments, the more simplified these fibers are going to be. The more segments, the more defined they're going to be. So depending on your style, you want to define less or more. If I play very little, it's going to look just very janky. So by default, they work pretty well. In case you want to add more noise, where you are going to need more definition, you can always increase the values. But to be fair, just the default value is working pretty well. And when it comes to other modifiers, you have also modifiers like curl, which can be very interesting when you're recreating braids and this kind of stuff. The way it works, we need to visualize curl in the 3D viewport, and it's going to generate more depth in our maps. Again, it's going to depend on the hairstyle that you want to implement. But again, I think at the end of the day, this type of items are going to depend more on your haircuts. So you need to be mindful on this kind of stuff. And finally, we also have the bend modifier that we have here. And bend modifier, what it's going to do is going to create a little bit of bend from root to tip. I personally don't like playing with it, but in some cases, you want to generate a little bit of variation in that sense. The last thing that I want to show you is that all these modifiers, not only you can turn them on and off just by toggling the different toggle buttons, but also you can even delete it. Like, let's say, for example, in my case, this bend modifier, I didn't really like it, so you can always go ahead and delete it. And also, since it's non-destructive workflow, you can always move modifiers up and down. You just select the modifier and then just move it into the new position. All right, so for this second block, I want to use my favorite tool, that is the hand draw mode. So we're going to click hand draw mode, and it's going to open a new setting, in this case, draw and hide and hide. So we're going to click draw again. And now if we position our pen on top of fiber block, the only thing that we need to do, we need to create a little spline, and it's going to automatically generate a clamp for us. One thing that I want you to notice is that the brush width is very important. So the bigger the brush is, the bigger the clamp is going to be generated. So depending on this setting and also the amount of strands, you will be able to generate different types of clamps. Now, let's say we didn't like some of the clamps that we just draw. If you come to hide and hide, you can visualize every single spline that you just created. Let's say this one, we didn't like it. If we select under the curve and then we click delete curve, in this case, delete all hidden curve, by default, you're going to see that it's going to delete that spline. Now that you know all the basic functions, now you can actually create every single type of clamp or at least fiber block in the style that you want. So I'm just going to start creating all these clamps at this stage. So if you head into the project settings and get material tab open, you're going to see the different parameters that you can start playing with. One of them is kind of obvious. You have the color from root to tip. So let's say we're going to be tweaking this color to something slightly more interesting. Maybe we can go some like a dark root color, and then for the tip we can head up to a bluish and go get something slightly lighter. Also, you can adjust a bunch of different things, like for example, the specularity. You can make it more specular or less specular. And then when it comes to the strands, you can always establish if you want them to look more tubular or more flat as well. So one of the cool things is that you can also override its current values. Let's say that you bake your textures and you want to make sure that your fibers look overall thinner. So you have the override values window that allows you to do that. If we tick on strand thickness, you can always establish new values on top of this one. So let's say, for example, we want our strands to look slightly thinner than before. So we can get to lower values like 0.8 or, for example, 0.5 that I think it was working even better. And also you can establish the density. Let's say that you felt that, yeah, the hair cards are just not dense enough. So you always can come back and adjust your density according to different values. Let's say something like 200 just to make it more dense. All right, so it's time to head into the baking process. For this process, we're going to establish a resolution of 2K texture. Once you hit Bake Maps, Fibershop is going to go through the whole process and generate all textures for you. So when it comes to bake and colors, you have the classic channels. In this case, I normally only want to be playing with my albedo channel. So let's go to albedo and color. And here you can do a whole bunch of different things. Like you can add filters, like for example, adding ambient occlusion, which can be very relevant for this case. And another very cool modifier is adding a root to tip. So automatically it's going to add a nice gradient from root to tip, which again, you can establish what type of blending mode you want to create. And then also you can even create some opacity. And once you're absolutely happy with everything, the only thing that you need to do, you need to select an output folder. And then here you have the different file formats you can use too. In my case, I'm going to be exporting PNG for now. And once you're happy with everything, you just go and hit export. The process is extremely fast, and in just in a second, you're going to have all your textures generated. And this is the resulting textures. It produces all the textures pretty well defined, so you can later on utilize these textures in Unreal Engine or Marmoset or whichever real-time engine that you are using. And that's it. You just made pro quality hair texture in minutes. No more hand painting every single strand, no more frustration. Fibershop is literally a game changer for 3D artists. If you found this tutorial helpful, please smash that like button, subscribe, or oh no, just drop a comment if you have any questions. Also, if you try Fibershop, just let me know what you think. I would love to see your results.